In Japan today, workers at the Fukushima nuclear power plant are struggling to contain radiation as fears of contamination spread across the country. Officials abandoned a plan to release more radioactive gases into the air to relieve pressure at the crippled reactor. And the government announced the plant itself would be scrapped once the emergency is resolved. And this troubling news: higher than normal levels of radiation has been found in spinach and milk that's been detected from farms about 90 miles from the reactor. The harrowing images we've seen day after day have many Americans asking one question: could it happen here? There are 104 nuclear reactors scattered around the country in some 31 states. At least a dozen are in areas at moderate to high risk of an earthquake. So what happens if a natural disaster sets off a catastrophic domino effect here in America? Is the government prepared to respond? Joining me now to answer that question, Michael Chertoff, who served as Secretary of Homeland Security in the Bush administration, and he's also chairman of the Chertoff Group. And with us, Bill Richardson, who wears many hats. He was Bill Clinton's Energy Secretary and Ambassador to the United Nations, and most recently served as Governor of New Mexico. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just before we get to the crucial issue of Japan and nuclear energy, let me ask you regarding Gaddafi's threats and the possibility of terrorism. Your job was to protect the homeland here. Do you think there's an increased risk now with this military activity over Libya?
I think you have to assume there's an increased risk in the sense that Gaddafi is a proven terrorist, and it's wise to assume that he's got the intent at some point to do something to retaliate. But I think his capability has been much degraded. For one thing, we have raised the level of our protection and our security over the years. I think his capability in the U.S. is not that great. If this operates today as it did when I was in office, we already have unfolded a plan to track all of his operatives in the United States and to make sure they're not in a position to do something. So
you're really prepared here for that?
I think we are prepared for this, but again, the important thing is to continue to watch him, not only here in the U.S., but look at American interests overseas, including people who are traveling or people who may be living overseas as well.
I mean, his son said, no, that's not our target when I asked him about retaliation. But I mean...
Well, you know, he's like a cornered rat. And a cornered rat will do whatever it has to do in order to defend itself or to strike back. So while right now my suspicion is they have their hands full, it's certainly something that's prudent to consider that he may seek to divert attention or even to push back by striking someplace else. But again, his capability now is not what it was 10 years ago. And more importantly, we've got a much more robust security apparatus.
And Governor Richardson, do you think that the U.S. is more at risk?
Well, I don't want to be an alarmist, and I agree with what the Secretary said, but he's a very unpredictable, he's almost a wild man right now. He's cornered. My concern is, does he have any chemical weapons? I am concerned about these mustard gas reports.
We asked Admiral Mullen about that.
No, I know what he said, but my concern is there's some allegations that he was directly responsible for Lockerbie. My concern is Americans in the Mediterranean flying, I think, should be extra cautious. I don't want to be an alarmist, but when a man is cornered, who is desperate, who wants to cling on to power, who sees his base narrowing, who is attacked, could be capable, as he has in the past, of very horrendous things.
Let's turn to the other major story, this potential cataclysmic meltdown. Is the United States totally prepared to handle something like that? Could that happen here?
Well, let's define what we mean by handle. If you had an earthquake that resulted in serious damage, devastating damage to a nuclear power plant, and I'm not saying that that would happen, it would be a very ugly situation. The critical issue would be to evacuate people in a timely fashion. Now, as part of the process of putting these plants in, and as part of our general planning process, we have worked to develop evacuation plans. But make no mistake, they have to be drilled, they have to be exercised, and if that hasn't been done, it's going to become a challenge.
Has it been done?
Well, I think it varies. I mean, if you look at California, they tend to be very good about the process of preparation. Other states may not be quite as intense about it. The thing to remember is this, though. No matter how good you are, it's going to be very difficult. And the way to minimize the difficulty is to have people be self-reliant, to have them well prepared, to make sure they're educated so they can take their own actions to get out of the way if in fact it looks like we're going to have a problem.
Mm-hmm. And Governor, you were governor of New Mexico when Secretary Chertoff was in office. To your mind, is the federal government prepared if it happened somewhere near your state?
Well, I can tell you that states generally are not prepared. And so we rely on the federal government. And I believe the Secretary is right. The federal government has to lead. I think the big message here is from the Japanese crisis is that we're looking at what happened in the oil spill, what happened with the mining disaster in West Virginia, the pipeline explosion. We have to look at the safety, cost, environmental risks of all our energy production. And I think the message with the nuclear reactors in Japan is that we should look at all our 104 reactors in the United States for their safety and preparedness than NRC.
And when you were governor, you saying the states aren't prepared, but did you believe that the federal government was prepared?
Well, I think this tragedy in Japan indicates that we need to be better prepared.
So is that a yes or a no?
Well, you know, I think again, Christian, you have to have a realistic expectation. I think the federal government has a general plan for catastrophic incidents. I think there are capabilities that could be deployed, but recognize in the initial hours after any kind of catastrophe, the government is not going to rescue everybody. That's not possible. And part of what I used to say and what Secretary Napolitano was saying is preparation begins at the home and at the business level. And that means if you're in an area which is earthquake prone, you've got to have a plan in place to evacuate if necessary, or you've got to know how to shelter yourself. Now, there's going to be a big exercise in May in the central part of the country, the New Madrid earthquake fault, which we put in process several years ago. And that's a great opportunity for communities to take a second look at their plans and make sure they're really serious and well prepared.
So what scares you most as a former government and having to rely on the federal government for this kind of rescue?
Well, first of all, we need to have evacuation plans. I don't think we have adequate ones around the country. Secondly, we have to look at licensing of new nuclear power plants. The president wants to proceed with 20 in the next decade. We want to have loan guarantees, but I think we have to have a timeout on nuclear power.
A timeout?
A timeout, not a moratorium, a timeout. Review the safety and cost of all these plants with a new licensing plans. Let's look at those that are being proposed in earthquake-prone areas. Let's look at those that are in seismic, where there's intensive seismic material. And then lastly, look at the ones, and there's about a third of our nuclear plants that have some of this Japanese technology that obviously has not worked. And I think internationally, we have to have some leadership in the whole range of the coolants in these reactors, the spent fuel. We have to look at ways that the international community, the International Atomic Energy Commission, looks at ways that there can be standardized safety procedures.
Do you think there needs to be a timeout?
Well, I agree with Bill. We need to obviously look at the lessons learned from what's happened in Japan. But what I would caution against is overreacting even to this catastrophic event. You know, we had a problem with BP in the Gulf, and the reaction was we can't drill in the Gulf. We have problems with other forms of energy, and people say, well, we shouldn't do that. Well, you know, at the end of the day, if we don't use coal, oil, natural gas, or nuclear, we're going to be sitting around the fire trying to warm ourselves like we did eons ago. So we're going to have to manage risk. That doesn't mean guaranteeing against anything. It means having in place ways to mitigate problems. And that's where I think the lessons of Japan can be very, very helpful.
And I think the lesson also for America is we have to look at renewable energy, natural gas, clean sources, but reassess our entire safety procedures when it comes to our fossil fuels. Look what happened in the Gulf. Look what happened in these mining disasters. A new conversation about safety, cost, and environmental risk of our energy production.
A new conversation indeed. Thank you both very much for joining us. Secretary Chertoff, Governor Richardson, thank you for coming in.